Hey everyone, today we're going to be making blocks for our QuiltCon Community Outreach Challenge quilt. Let's start by gathering our supplies. First, we're going to have a light box. We're going to have our foundation paper piecing template, some type of a hard edge like this cardstock mailer, my fabric pieces, my finger presser, my rotary cutter, and my add a quarter ruler. Our first step is going to be using that cardstock edge to fold and crease along all of the sewing lines on the foundation paper piecing template. I personally find it easier to fold along all of the lines first before I start actually sewing any fabric on, and you'll see why we use these folds later on as we progress through the tutorial. So let's start sewing. Here I'm going to be sewing fabric number 1 to fabric number 2, one of the squares to one of the gray triangles. When you're foundation paper piecing, you should always be looking at the very front of the template so I can read the names, I can see the numbers, and I can see my sewing lines. Here you can see I've aligned the purple fabric underneath, and I have plenty of seam allowance around the edges of my sewing lines. Now I'm going to align my gray fabric by folding the template over, and you can see here I've placed it underneath the purple fabric, which I'm going to be sewing it to. I'm always thinking about both of my seams, the one I'm about to sew and the one after that. So I want to make sure that I have enough fabric for each seam allowance hanging over the edges of the template, and you can see here that I do. Now I'm going to go move to the sewing machine. First thing I do when I turn on my machine is shorten my stitch length, somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8. This will make it much easier to tear out the papers later when we're all finished. For the most accuracy, I'm going to start sewing at the top of the line, which is in the middle of the template. But before I start sewing, I want to check that my needle down position is exactly in the corner of that square. And then I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and sew directly on the line, backstitching at the end. Great, let's check our work. What I'm checking for here is to make sure that this gray piece of fabric I just sewed onto the purple, when I flip it open, it does in fact cover the entire space I was trying to cover. And I want to check that I have enough hanging over this next seam that I'm going to sew before I trim the seam that I just finished sewing. Everything looks good, so I think it's pretty safe here to go ahead and trim the first seam that I just sewed. I'm going to get this light box out of the way. I'm going to fold my paper back over. I'm going to use my add a quarter ruler here. And what's really nice about this ruler is it has an edge, and the edge of that ruler butts right up against the edge of the paper, as you can see there. I'm going to use my rotary cutter, and I'm just going to give that a nice trim. Okay, so we're going to sew on fabric number 3 next. This is another gray triangle. It's going to fit right here on the top of the purple square. I'm going to flip my template over because remember I should be able to read the words and see all of the lines I'm going to sew on. I'm going to fold the template over and I'm going to align the gray fabric with the triangle on the template. Now I'm always thinking about my current seam and my next seam, which is this diagonal line here. And I really don't like the amount of fabric that I have hanging over the edge. So I'm going to adjust this just a little bit to make sure that the next seam I sew will have enough seam allowance. So that looks a little bit better. I've got a little bit more hanging over. I've still got plenty on either side of the template and the edges. And now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew straight down this line here. And same thing as the last time, I'm going to start sewing in the middle of the template for the most accuracy. Again, I want to check and make sure my needle down position is right in the corner of that square before I start sewing. I will backstitch at the beginning and at the end of the line, sewing directly on the line. Again, best practice for me is always to make sure that I check my work before I trim the seam that I just sewed. So I'm going to flip this piece of gray fabric over here and I'm going to check it on both sides. I can see here clearly that I've got enough allowance over all of the edges, so my seam I'm about to sew and the edges of the template. So it's safe to go ahead and trim this seam allowance here. Same thing, I'm going to move my light box out of the way because I don't have a cutting pad on top of that. I'm going to fold the template over. Again, I'm going to use that nice add a quarter ruler with that edge that butts up against the paper for me. Trim away, and then I'm going to use my finger presser again to press this gray fabric open. And you can see here what a nice point I have on my square. Next, we're going to sew on fabric number 4, which is the dark teal. This is probably the biggest piece we have to sew on. I'm going to align the fat edge of the fabric to make sure it lines up with the fat edge that I can see on the template. I'm going to fold my template over. I'm going to put my fabric on the light box, and I'm going to align my template to make sure that the fabric underneath is covering everything on the template. Now, my corner is sticking off of the edge, and I can see that using the light box, so I'm going to adjust this over to the left just a little bit so that my corner now, I've got fabric on both sides hanging over the edges. Everything looks good. I can see my next seam, not this seam, but the next seam has enough fabric as well. So I'm going to open this up and head over to the sewing machine. Now this is a nice long straight line that goes edge to edge, so I don't need to check needle down position. I'm just going to go ahead and start sewing directly on the line. So again, we're going to check our work before we trim anything off. I'm going to flip my teal piece of fabric over and open that up. And you can see very clearly here in this image on the light box that I've got plenty of fabric hanging over the edge there, so everything looks good. And I can go ahead and trim, again using that add a quarter ruler and my rotary cutter. Next, we're going to sew on fabric number 5, which is the darker yellow saffron. And again, this shape is a little bit of an odd shape with a wider edge. This time it's facing to the left. I'm going to line it up with my template, fold my template over, and line my fabric up. So I've got plenty of room hanging over the edge here, as you can see. And I can also see that this corner actually goes over the fabric. So I'm going to realign this by adjusting it to the right. And now I can see I do have fabric over the edge on both sides, which means it's safe to sew. I can also see my next seam, not this seam, and there's plenty of coverage over the edge. So I'm going to sew directly along this straight line here. And it took me a few tries, but I finally figured out how to rig my camera so that you can see me sewing from the top down. As you can see, I'm sewing directly on the line and I'm back stitching at the beginning and the end. So we're going to head to the light box and check our work before trimming anything. I'm going to make sure that when I fold this over, everything I need to be covered is covered. And I can see there the next line I will need to sew on, and it looks like it has plenty of coverage over it, so we are safe to trim. I'm going to move the light box out of the way, again using my add a quarter ruler. I'm going to trim that extra fabric out of the way. And then I'm going to use my finger presser to give that seam a nice flat press. On to the last piece of fabric, number 6. This is the lightest yellow canary, and this is the corner that I need to cover. So I'm going to flip my template over. Remember, I should be able to read what's on the template. I'm going to flip my corner down, and I'm going to align the template over the piece of fabric. Now this one is a little bit more snug. Now that's got plenty of fabric that's in the seam allowance. So I'm going to need to adjust this a little bit because I can see, it's hard to see with the light box because the fabrics are so dark on the video. But I can see that this bottom corner down here, that one's okay. I've got plenty of coverage there. I'm going to give this a little more of an adjustment. But I can kind of see that this corner right here, I'm still not loving what it looks like. I can see that the line is not quite straight. So I'm going to adjust this just a little bit more before I take it over and sew it. Now I can still see that I'm not very satisfied with this. This straight line here is not quite lining up the way I would like it to. It's coming down here. I can see that this fabric is not going to quite cover that if I were to flip it over. So I'm going to reposition this one more time. And I'm going to sew on the very last seam. Here we go, straight down the line. All right, one last quality check. Let's hope for the best here. So I'm going to flip this over and make sure I've got everything covered that I need covered. And phew, looks like we just made it. So I deem this safe to trim. I'm going to use that add a quarter ruler and make sure that I've got a 1/4 inch seam left over. And I'm going to finger press that canary last piece open. And my template is indeed all covered. So I'm going to finger press that open before we trim the block down. Okay, we've got all of our fabric sewn on. Everything looks good. Let's flip this baby over and we're going to trim all of the excess fabric off around the edges. all the way around. Now my favorite ruler to use for this is the Quilter Select, and the reason for that is because these lines are so thin and they really line up well with the thin lines that I make on the templates that I use. So we're going to position those 1/4 inch lines together, and I'm going to use a safety glove for this because I don't have a protective edge like I did with my add a 1/4 ruler, and I'm going to go ahead and trim around all 4 sides of the block. And here we are. You can see what a nice corner I have where the square and the gray triangles meet up. And it's all finished. 47 more blocks to go, y'all.